January 28, 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. Dwight Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, walked into his commander's office with a message that made Eisenhower's jaw tighten. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was requesting a private dinner meeting, just the two of them, no staff officers, no witnesses. Montgomery wanted to clear the air after the tensions following the Battle of the Bulge. Smith watched Eisenhower read the message. He saw his commander's hand grip the paper harder than necessary. "Do you want me to decline?" Smith asked. Eisenhower considered this for a long moment. The smart move was to say no, send a polite refusal, keep Montgomery at arm's length, manage the relationship through official channels where staff officers could control the conversation. But Eisenhower was exhausted from managing Montgomery through intermediaries. The press conference disaster, the demand for permanent American armies, the constant complaints about strategy, the barely concealed contempt for American commanders. Maybe a private conversation could actually resolve some of these issues. Or maybe Eisenhower just wanted the satisfaction of telling Montgomery directly what he thought of his behavior. "No," Eisenhower said finally. "I'll meet with him. Maybe if we talk honestly without an audience, we can actually understand each other." Smith looked doubtful but nodded. He would arrange the dinner. What neither man knew was that this private dinner would become one of the most explosive confrontations between Allied commanders in the entire war, a confrontation where two men who had been allies for 3 years would come within seconds of physical violence, where carefully maintained diplomatic facades would shatter completely, where Eisenhower would say things to Montgomery that no American commander had dared say before, and where Montgomery would learn, too late, that even Eisenhower's legendary patience had limits. The dinner was scheduled for February 2, 1945, at a small chateau outside Brussels that Montgomery was using as his headquarters. Eisenhower arrived by staff car at 7 p.m. No aides, no security detail beyond his driver. Just Eisenhower and a bottle of wine he'd brought as a diplomatic gesture. Montgomery met him at the door personally. "Ike, good of you to come. I thought it was time we talked frankly." Eisenhower noticed Montgomery's phrasing, talked frankly, as if they hadn't been communicating for months, as if the problem was lack of communication rather than fundamental disagreement. But Eisenhower was determined to make this work. He was tired of the tension, tired of the political maneuvering. Maybe an honest conversation could actually improve their working relationship. They sat down to dinner. Montgomery's staff had prepared a formal meal, multiple courses, fine china, the kind of elaborate setup that Montgomery loved and Eisenhower found unnecessarily complicated. The conversation started cordially enough. Montgomery talked about the weather, the progress of the war, the challenges of coalition command. Eisenhower reciprocated with professional small talk. They were both being careful, both watching for openings, both aware that this dinner could go very wrong very quickly. Then Montgomery brought up the Battle of the Bulge. "I think we handled that situation rather well," Montgomery said. "Once I took command of the northern sector, we were able to stabilize the line and stop the German advance." Eisenhower set down his fork carefully. Here it was, the beginning of the conversation he'd been dreading. Montgomery was about to rewrite the history of the Bulge with himself as the hero who saved the Americans. "The situation was stabilized by multiple commanders," Eisenhower said evenly, "including Patton's relief from Bastogne from the south." Montgomery waved this away. Yes, Patton did his part, but the strategic crisis was in the north. That's where British command made the difference." Eisenhower felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm. Monty, you commanded 2 American armies for 3 weeks during an emergency. That doesn't make you the savior of the American army." Montgomery smiled in a way that Eisenhower found intensely patronizing. "Of course not, Ike. I'm simply saying that when things got difficult, having experienced command at the strategic level proved valuable." The implication was clear. When American commanders got in trouble, they needed British leadership to bail them out. Eisenhower took a sip of wine and forced himself to stay calm. This was exactly why he'd agreed to the dinner, to have this conversation honestly rather than through diplomatic channels. "What exactly did you want to discuss tonight, Monty?" Montgomery leaned back in his chair. "Strategy, Ike, the way forward. I think we need to have an honest conversation about how to win this war." What Montgomery meant was, "I'm going to explain why my strategic vision is correct and yours is wrong." And Eisenhower was about to hear every criticism Montgomery had been saving up for months. Montgomery began his strategic presentation as if he were lecturing at a staff college. "The broad front strategy isn't working, Ike. We're dispersing our strength across the entire front. No concentrated power, no decisive thrust." Eisenhower had heard this argument dozens of times. Montgomery wanted all Allied resources concentrated for a single massive offensive in the North, under his command, naturally. "We've been through this," Eisenhower said. "A concentrated thrust would expose our flanks. The Germans would counterattack the shoulders. We'd end up with another Market Garden." Montgomery's face hardened at the mention of Market Garden, the failed offensive in September 1944 that had cost thousands of casualties and achieved nothing. "Market Garden failed because we didn't commit sufficient resources," Montgomery said. Eisenhower couldn't believe what he was hearing. Market Garden had used 3 airborne divisions, massive artillery support, and an entire armored corps. The problem wasn't resources. The problem was Montgomery's plan ignored intelligence about German armor in the area. But Eisenhower didn't say that. Not yet. "The broad front strategy is working," Eisenhower said instead. "We're advancing on all sectors. The Germans can't concentrate their reserves because they have to defend everywhere." Montgomery shook his head as if Eisenhower was a slow student who didn't understand the lesson. "That's exactly the problem. We're advancing slowly everywhere instead of winning decisively somewhere. Give me the resources for a concentrated thrust, and I'll end this war by March." "You said that about Market Garden," Eisenhower said quietly. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Montgomery's smile disappeared completely. "Market Garden was 90% successful. We held the bridge at Nijmegen. We advanced our lines. The failure at Arnhem doesn't negate." "It was a complete failure," Eisenhower interrupted. His voice was still calm, but harder now. "We lost an entire airborne division. We gained nothing of strategic value, and you're still calling it 90% successful." Montgomery stood up from the table. "I will not sit here and have my operational record criticized by—" He stopped himself, but not before Eisenhower heard what he was about to say. "By someone who had never commanded troops in combat." Eisenhower stood up as well. "By who, Monty? By your superior officer? By the Supreme Allied Commander? Finish the sentence." Montgomery's face was flushed. "By someone who doesn't understand operational warfare the way I do." There it was, the fundamental contempt Montgomery had been hiding behind diplomatic language for months. Eisenhower didn't understand warfare, not the way Montgomery did, not the way a real combat commander did. Eisenhower walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Montgomery. "I understand this much," Eisenhower said. His voice was quiet, but carrying an edge his staff would have recognized as dangerous. I understand that coalition warfare requires more than tactical brilliance. It requires working with allies instead of insulting them. Montgomery's response was immediate and cutting. Maybe if American commanders focused more on tactical brilliance and less on pleasing everyone, we'd have won this war already. Eisenhower felt something snap inside him. For 3 years he had managed this alliance, balanced British pride against American strength, defended Montgomery to angry American generals, absorbed Montgomery's condescension with diplomatic patience. And here was Montgomery, in a private dinner he had requested, essentially calling Eisenhower incompetent. "Sit down," Eisenhower said. Montgomery didn't move. "I said sit down," Eisenhower repeated. His voice had changed. This wasn't a request. Montgomery sat, slowly, making it clear he was choosing to sit rather than following an order. Eisenhower remained standing. "Let me explain something to you, Monty, something I should have explained a long time ago." Montgomery started to speak, but Eisenhower cut him off. "You're going to listen. For once in your life, you're going to shut up and listen." Montgomery's eyes widened. Eisenhower had never spoken to him this way before. "You think I don't understand warfare because I haven't commanded troops in combat. You think American generals are amateurs who need British expertise to succeed. You think you're the smartest commander in this theater." Eisenhower leaned forward, hands on the table. "You might be brilliant, Monty. You might be a tactical genius, but you are poison to this alliance. And if you don't change, I will relieve you of command. I don't care what Churchill says. I don't care what the British press writes. I will fire you and deal with the political fallout." Montgomery's face went pale. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," Eisenhower said. "Give me one more reason. One more press conference where you steal credit from American troops. One more demand that you command American armies permanently. One more condescending lecture about how I don't understand strategy." Eisenhower straightened up. "I have been patient with you because I respect British sacrifices in this war, because Churchill needs you for political reasons, because firing you would create a crisis I'd rather avoid." He paused. "But my patience is not infinite, and you just found the limit." Montgomery sat in stunned silence. No one spoke to him this way, not his own subordinates, not British commanders, certainly not Americans. When he finally responded, his voice was shaking with barely controlled fury. "How dare you threaten me? I am a field marshal of the British Empire. I have won battles when you were planning exercises in the United States. I do not answer to you for my operational decisions." Eisenhower's response was ice cold. "Yes, you do." Montgomery stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I will report this conversation to the Prime Minister. Your threat to relieve me is an insult to Britain." "Report whatever you want, but understand this. Churchill can't protect you if I decide you're undermining Allied operations." Montgomery took a step toward Eisenhower. For a moment, both men stood face to face, inches apart. Montgomery's fists were clenched. Eisenhower's posture was rigid. Later, Eisenhower's driver would report that he heard raised voices from inside the chateau, that he briefly considered whether he should intervene. But he didn't know that inside, two of the most powerful commanders in the Allied army were seconds away from actual physical violence. "You're making a mistake," Montgomery said. His voice was low and threatening. "The only mistake I've made," Eisenhower shot back, "is tolerating your behavior for this long." Montgomery's hand moved slightly. Eisenhower saw it. For a fraction of a second, both men realized how close they were to crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. A physical confrontation between the Supreme Allied Commander and Britain's senior field marshal would be a scandal that could destroy the Western Alliance. Montgomery seemed to realize this first. He took a half step back, but the fury in his eyes didn't diminish. "If you relieve me," Montgomery said carefully, "you will destroy British confidence in American leadership. Churchill will protest to Roosevelt. The British press will call it American arrogance. Your political career will be over." Eisenhower smiled grimly. "Threatening my political career now, Monty? What happened to discussing strategy?" "I'm stating facts," Montgomery said. "Then let me state some facts," Eisenhower replied. "American forces outnumber British forces 3-1 in this theater. American supplies keep this army functioning. American public support is essential to continuing the war." He paused to let that sink in. "If I have to choose between keeping you happy and keeping American commanders loyal, I will choose American commanders every time." Montgomery's face was flushed with anger. "So it comes down to nationalism. I thought you were above that, Ike." "This isn't nationalism," Eisenhower said. "This is reality. You have been treating American commanders like incompetent children who need British supervision. You have claimed credit for American victories. You have undermined my authority at every opportunity." Eisenhower's voice got quieter, but somehow more intense. "And you did all of this while commanding American armies, armies I gave you temporary command of during an emergency, armies you now think you deserve to command permanently." Montgomery started to respond, but Eisenhower wasn't finished. "Do you know what Bradley told me last week? He said if you keep command of American armies, he'll resign. Patton said the same thing. Simpson would probably follow." Eisenhower let that information hang in the air. "So here's your choice, Monty. You can continue being difficult and lose command of all American forces immediately, or you can start acting like part of this team and keep the limited command you have for the Rhine crossing." Montgomery's voice was tight with rage. "That's extortion. That's coalition warfare, something you've never understood." Montgomery walked to the window, stared out at the darkness. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, less angry, more bitter. "You think I don't understand coalition warfare? I've been managing your fragile American egos for 2 years." Eisenhower almost laughed. "Managing our egos? Is that what you call it?" Montgomery turned around. "Your generals are children playing at war. Patton is a cowboy who thinks speed substitutes for planning. Bradley is competent but unimaginative. And you—" He paused. "You're a politician in a uniform. You care more about keeping everyone happy than winning battles." Eisenhower walked over to stand near Montgomery. "And you," he said quietly, "are a brilliant tactician who can't see beyond his own ego." For a moment, both men were silent. Then Montgomery said something Eisenhower didn't expect. "You're right." Eisenhower stared at him. Montgomery continued, his voice tired now rather than angry. "I am poison to this alliance. I know that. I've known it for months." He sat down heavily. "But I can't stop. Do you know why?" Eisenhower waited. "Because if I admit American methods work, I'm admitting Britain doesn't matter anymore. If I acknowledge Patton's brilliance, I'm acknowledging British generals are obsolete. If I defer to your strategic judgment, I'm accepting that British influence in this alliance is finished." Montgomery looked up at Eisenhower. "Every time I fight with you, every time I demand more authority, every time I claim credit for victories, I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it for Britain, because we're losing this war." Eisenhower was confused. "We're winning." "Not the shooting war," Montgomery interrupted. "The other war, the one that determines what happens after the Germans surrender. Britain is losing that war badly." He stood up and poured himself a drink. "When this war ends, America will dominate the West. British power will be finished. Our empire will crumble. Our influence will evaporate. Everything we fought for will have been in vain." Montgomery took a long drink. "So yes, I fight for every scrap of authority. I claim credit for every victory.
I try to command as many American troops as possible, because those are the only weapons I have left to preserve British relevance." He looked directly at Eisenhower. "You can relieve me if you want. Maybe you should. But whoever replaces me will face the same problem. How do you maintain British prestige in an American-dominated alliance?" For the first time in the conversation, Eisenhower heard something in Montgomery's voice other than arrogance. He heard desperation.
Eisenhower sat down across from Montgomery. The anger had drained from the room. Something else had replaced it. Not quite understanding, but maybe the beginning of it. "I know Britain is in a difficult position," Eisenhower said carefully. "I'm not blind to the political realities." Montgomery laughed bitterly. "Then why are you making it worse? Every time you reduce my command, every time you support American generals over me, you're accelerating British decline." "That's not my job," Eisenhower said. "My job is to win this war as efficiently as possible, not to manage British post-war prestige." "Those things are connected," Montgomery insisted. "If Britain emerges from this war looking like America's subordinate, we'll be America's subordinate for the next 50 years. Eisenhower understood the logic, but he also understood why it was flawed. "Monty, British prestige isn't determined by whether you command American armies. It's determined by how well British forces fight, by British contributions to victory, by whether British commanders can work effectively in a coalition." He leaned forward. "You're damaging British prestige, not protecting it. Every time you insult American commanders, you make it harder for people to respect British leadership. Every time you claim credit you didn't earn, you make British achievements look hollow." Montgomery started to argue, but Eisenhower continued. "If you want to protect British prestige, start treating American generals like partners instead of inferiors. Coordinate with Bradley instead of fighting him. Acknowledge when American methods work. Build a reputation as someone who can lead a coalition, not someone who sabotages it." Montgomery was quiet for a long moment. "That's easy for you to say. America is rising. You can afford to be generous and diplomatic. Britain is falling. Every concession I make accelerates that fall." "Every fight you pick does the same thing," Eisenhower countered, "just in a different way." Both men sat in silence, drinking. Finally, Montgomery spoke. "I can't do what you're asking. It's not in my nature. I'm not a diplomat. I'm a field marshal who wins battles by being more ruthless and more certain than my enemies." "Then you're going to lose this battle," Eisenhower said quietly. "Not against the Germans, against me, against American commanders, against the political reality that Britain needs America more than America needs Britain." Montgomery set down his glass. "Are you really going to relieve me?" Eisenhower considered the question carefully. "I don't want to. It would create exactly the kind of political crisis both our countries want to avoid. But if you force my hand, yes, I will." "What would force your hand?" "Another press conference like the one after the Bulge," Eisenhower said. "Another demand for permanent command of American armies. Another attempt to undermine my authority with Churchill or the combined chiefs." He paused. "Basically, if you continue doing what you've been doing, I'll have no choice." Montgomery nodded slowly. "And if I moderate my behavior?" "Then we work together for the next few months until Germany surrenders. You command British and Canadian forces, you get 9th Army for the Rhine crossing, then it returns to American command. You win your battles and go home a hero." Eisenhower met Montgomery's eyes, and everyone pretends this conversation never happened. Montgomery stood up and walked to the window again. Eisenhower watched him, unsure how this would resolve. Everything that had been said tonight could destroy their professional relationship, could leak to the press and create exactly the scandal both wanted to avoid. But maybe, just maybe, the honest confrontation would actually improve things. Montgomery turned around. "I'll accept your terms, with one condition." Eisenhower waited. "Stop treating me like a problem to be managed. If we're going to work together, treat me like a fellow commander whose judgment you respect, even when you disagree with it." Eisenhower considered this. "I can do that, with one condition of my own." Montgomery nodded for him to continue. "Stop treating American commanders like amateurs who need your supervision. Respect goes both ways." Montgomery was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "Agreed." The handshake was firm but not warm. This wasn't friendship. This was a professional agreement between two commanders who understood they needed each other, even if they didn't particularly like each other. "One more thing," Eisenhower said. "This conversation stays between us. No reporting to Churchill, no telling your staff, no using it for political leverage later." Montgomery nodded. "Agreed. On the same terms, you don't tell Bradley or Patton what I said about them." "Agreed." Both men sat back down. The tension had eased, but not disappeared. Montgomery poured them both another drink. "For what it's worth, Ike, I do respect you. You've held this alliance together through circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser commander." Eisenhower accepted the compliment carefully. Coming from Montgomery, this was significant. "And I respect your tactical ability," Eisenhower said. "When you plan an operation, it gets done. I just wish you could do it without alienating everyone around you." Montgomery smiled slightly. "Can't have everything." They talked for another hour, about the war, about their families, about what would happen after Germany surrendered. The conversation was still guarded, still careful, but something had shifted. They had seen each other without the diplomatic masks, had said things that needed to be said, had come to an understanding that was ugly and honest and maybe workable. When Eisenhower left that night, Montgomery walked him to his car. "Thank you for coming," Montgomery said. "I know this wasn't pleasant." "It was necessary," Eisenhower replied. "Will we be able to work together now?" Eisenhower thought about the question carefully. "I think so, as long as we both remember what we discussed tonight." "The limits of your patience," Montgomery said with a slight smile. "And the limits of your authority," Eisenhower replied. Both men understood what remained unsaid. This had been their last chance. The next crisis would end with Montgomery's relief. Eisenhower's driver noticed his commander was unusually quiet during the drive back to Versailles. When they arrived, Bedell Smith was waiting. "How did it go?" Smith asked. Eisenhower considered the question. "How did you explain that you'd almost come to blows with Britain's senior field marshal, that you'd threatened to fire him, that he'd essentially admitted he was sabotaging the alliance to protect British prestige?" "It went honestly," Eisenhower said finally. "We had the conversation we should have had months ago." And we have an understanding. Montgomery keeps 9th Army for the Rhine crossing, then it returns to Bradley. He commands British and Canadian forces for the rest of the war, and he stops fighting me on every strategic decision. Smith looked skeptical. "You believe he'll actually do that?" "I believe he understands the alternative," Eisenhower said. Smith waited for elaboration, but Eisenhower just shook his head. "The conversation stays private. I gave my word." What Eisenhower didn't tell Smith was how close it had come to physical violence, how Montgomery's hand had clenched, how both men had stood inches apart, fury radiating between them. That would stay between Eisenhower and Montgomery forever. At Montgomery's headquarters, de Gongon asked similar questions. Montgomery was even less forthcoming. "We clarified some things," Montgomery said. "The command structure going forward is settled." "Did you get what you wanted?" de Gaunt asked. Montgomery's answer was careful. "I got what was possible, under the circumstances." What he didn't say, Eisenhower had backed him into a corner and forced him to choose between accepting limited authority or losing all authority. That Montgomery had chosen to accept the limited authority told de Gaunt everything he needed to know. The confrontation had been decisive. Montgomery had lost. Over the following weeks, Montgomery's behavior changed noticeably. He still argued with Eisenhower about strategy, but the arguments were professional rather than personal. He still wanted more resources for his operations, but he accepted Eisenhower's decisions without threatening to appeal to Churchill. He coordinated with Bradley on the Rhine crossing instead of trying to exclude American commanders from planning. American generals noticed the change. "What happened to Monty?" Bradley asked Eisenhower. "He's almost reasonable now." Eisenhower just smiled. "We had a conversation." "Must have been some conversation." "It was necessary," Eisenhower said, the same word he'd used with Montgomery. The Rhine crossing in late March 1945 went more smoothly than anyone expected. Montgomery's planning was meticulous. Simpson's Ninth Army executed their role professionally. British and American forces coordinated effectively. After the operation, Ninth Army returned to American command as agreed. Montgomery didn't protest, didn't demand extensions, didn't appeal to Churchill. He had learned the lesson Eisenhower taught him at that private dinner. There were limits. The dinner between Eisenhower and Montgomery on February 2, 1945, was never mentioned in official histories. Neither man wrote about it in their memoirs. No staff officers leaked details to the press. The confrontation remained private. But it changed the dynamics of Allied command for the final months of the war. Montgomery stopped trying to expand his authority over American forces. Eisenhower stopped having to defend every strategic decision against Montgomery's criticism. The alliance didn't become friendly, but it became functional. That was what the dinner accomplished. Two commanders who had been circling toward open conflict found a way to work together through brutal honesty. Eisenhower had threatened Montgomery's career and forced him to accept limits. Montgomery had admitted his behavior was destroying British prestige rather than protecting it. Both had said things that could never be unsaid. And paradoxically, that honesty made their professional relationship stronger, because they both understood exactly where they stood. Years later, after both men had retired, a journalist asked Eisenhower about his relationship with Montgomery. Eisenhower's answer was diplomatic. Monty was a brilliant tactician and a difficult ally. Managing that relationship required patience and occasionally firmness, but we found a way to work together effectively. The journalist pressed for details about conflicts between them. Eisenhower smiled and declined to elaborate. Some conversations between commanders need to stay private. When Montgomery was asked the same question, his response was characteristically different. Eisenhower was a political general who understood coalition management better than operational warfare. We had our disagreements, but he kept the alliance functioning. Then Montgomery added something revealing. He was tougher than people gave him credit for. I learned that the hard way. The journalist asked what he meant. Montgomery just smiled and changed the subject. But those who knew both men understood. There had been a confrontation, a moment when the diplomatic facade collapsed and both men showed their true natures. Eisenhower, the coalition manager, became Eisenhower, the commander, who wouldn't tolerate insubordination. Montgomery, the arrogant field marshal, became Montgomery, the desperate defender of fading British power. And in that chateau outside Brussels, with raised voices and clenched fists, they reached an understanding that formal diplomacy had failed to achieve. It wasn't a friendship. It wasn't even mutual respect, but it was enough to get them through the final months of the war. And sometimes, in coalition warfare, enough is all you can hope for. The dinner where Eisenhower and Montgomery almost came to blows became the moment when both men learned their limits. Eisenhower learned how far he could push a British field marshal before risking political disaster. Montgomery learned how far he could push an American supreme commander before losing everything. And having learned those limits, they never tested them again.